Millions of fans watched the San Diego Chargers of the early 1980s run the most explosive passing offense the league had ever seen. A system so revolutionary that three different Hall of Famers once stood together at their own coach's funeral and openly wondered why he still wasn't in Canton with them. Air Coryell rewrote how football was played and never once delivered the championship it seemed built for. This is where the San Diego Chargers of the Air Coryell era really ended up. One is the powerful running back who quietly anchored the most explosive offense in football before cocaine took apart a career that once ranked among the best of his era. Chuck Muncie rushed for 1,144 yards and a league-leading 19 touchdowns in 1981, forming the ground complement to Dan Fouts' record-setting passing attack and helping San Diego capture back-to-back division titles. Born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, Muncie starred at Cal Berkeley before New Orleans made him the third overall pick in 1976, and after a trade brought him to San Diego in 1980, he became a three-time Pro Bowler who ran for 120 yards and a touchdown in the legendary Epic in Miami playoff game. Muncie had admitted to using cocaine, marijuana, and alcohol throughout his career, at one point telling reporters he would do drugs the night before games and still perform on pure talent alone. Head coach Don Coryell personally sent him for rehabilitation in 1982, but the habit continued. Commissioner Pete Rozelle suspended Muncie for the entire 1984 season after a positive cocaine test, effectively ending his career at 29 years old despite a brief, failed comeback attempt with Minnesota. In 1989, 5 years after his retirement, Muncie was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for selling cocaine. He turned his life around after his release, working with the Boys and Girls Clubs of America for 2 decades and founding the Chuck Muncie Youth Foundation to mentor at-risk children using his own story as a warning. Chuck Muncie died of a heart attack at his Los Angeles area home on May 13, 2013, at age 60. Muncie ran for more combined yards and touchdowns than nearly any back of his era, despite battling addiction the entire time. Chuck Muncie's former wife said his most impressive work happened only after football was over, spending the second half of his life trying to keep other kids from making the same choices that cost him his career. 2 is the tight end whose single playoff performance became one of the most replayed images in NFL history, a man who nearly collapsed from exhaustion and kept playing anyway. Kellen Winslow caught 13 passes for 166 yards in the legendary 1981 Epic in Miami playoff game, a 4-hour, 41-38 overtime victory during which he was treated on the sideline for dehydration, severe leg cramps, a pinched nerve in his shoulder, and a lip gash requiring 3 stitches, later saying he had never felt so close to death before. Born in East St. Louis, Illinois in 1957, Winslow didn't play organized football until his senior year of high school, describing himself as a self-professed chess-playing nerd before San Diego made him a first-round pick in 1979 out of Missouri. He is widely credited with essentially inventing the modern H-back tight end position, leading the NFL in receptions twice and once catching 5 touchdown passes in a single game against Oakland, a record still unmatched by any tight end since. The iconic photograph of Winslow being half carried off the field by 2 teammates after the Miami game became one of the defining images of NFL toughness, replayed for decades afterward. A serious knee injury in 1984 derailed what had been a record-setting pace, and though he returned to play through 1987, he never fully regained his earlier explosiveness, retiring after a single preseason appearance in 1988. He was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1995. Winslow redefined what a tight end could do in a passing offense, using a combination of size and route running nobody at his position had shown before. Kellen Winslow's most famous moment wasn't a touchdown at all, but the picture of his own body being carried off a field he had nearly given everything to for 4 straight hours. If Winslow's exhaustion is the image that stuck with you, tell me in the comments which member of this offense hit you hardest, because the next 2 names on this list anchored the side of the ball that history mostly forgot to talk about. 3 is the massive defensive tackle who became one of the first NFL linemen to weigh over 300 pounds, anchoring a defensive front that never got its championship in San Diego, but eventually found one somewhere else entirely. Louis Kelcher earned 3 Pro Bowl selections and 2 first-team All-Pro honors as part of the Bruise Brothers, a fearsome San Diego defensive line that led the NFL with 60 sacks in 1980 alongside Fred Dean and Gary Big Hands Johnson. Born in Beaumont, Texas in 1953, Kelcher stood 6 feet 5 and once said his own playing weight varied between 280 pounds and infinity, reaching as high as 345 pounds before one training camp while wearing a size 17 EEE shoe. He recorded a staggering 20 tackles in the 1980 AFC Championship game against Oakland and forced a crucial fumble late in the Epic in Miami victory the following year. Despite anchoring one of the most feared defensive fronts of the era, Kelcher and the Chargers could never get past the conference championship round, and he was traded to San Francisco in March of 1984 after asking specifically not to play for San Diego again. Reunited that season with former Chargers teammates Fred Dean and Gary Johnson, Kelcher finally won the championship that had eluded him for 9 seasons, claiming a Super Bowl 19 ring with the 49ers before retiring. He is alive today, in his early 70s. Kelcher anchored one of the most dominant defensive lines in football, using a combination of size nobody else in the league was carrying at the time. Louis Kelcher spent 9 seasons in San Diego without ever reaching the mountaintop, and needed a trade to the team that had nothing to do with Air Coryell to finally get there. 4 is the pass rusher whose contract dispute with San Diego's ownership accidentally launched an entirely different dynasty 300 miles up the California coast. Fred Dean recorded an unofficial 93 career sacks and made 4 Pro Bowls, anchoring San Diego's Bruise Brothers defensive front before a salary standoff with team ownership led to a mid-season trade to San Francisco in October of 1981. Born in Arcadia, Louisiana in 1949, Dean was a second-round pick out of Louisiana Tech in 1975, and later said he was making the same salary as his own brother-in-law, a truck driver, at the height of his NFL production. In his very first game with the 49ers, playing with only a couple of practices under his belt, Dean recorded 6 sacks against Dallas quarterback Danny White, and he went on to help San Francisco win Super Bowl 16 that same season and Super Bowl 19 3 years later, earning UPI NFC Defensive Player of the Year honors along the way. Dean was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2008, telling the crowd he considered stepping across to San Francisco like reaching the other side of the rainbow. He continued making appearances at Hall of Fame and alumni events for over a decade afterward. In October of 2020, Dean was hospitalized in intensive care with COVID-19, and he died from the virus on October 14, 2020, at age 68. Dean was traded away from San Diego specifically because ownership wouldn't pay him what his own production was worth. Fred Dean's departure from the Chargers over a few $1,000s ended up handing the San Francisco 49ers the missing piece of the very dynasty that would go on to define the entire decade after his own team let him go. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because the last 2 names on this list represent the 2 very different endings this entire era could have handed down. 5 is the quarterback who authored the most prolific passing seasons the NFL had ever recorded, and who built one of the sport's longest broadcasting careers afterward, without ever needing a comeback story to define him. Dan Fouts led the NFL in passing yards 4 consecutive seasons, from 1979 to 1982. Becoming the first quarterback in league history to throw for over 4,000 yards in a season, and doing it 3 years in a row, earning NFL and AFC Player of the Year honors in 1982, and league co-MVP the following year. Born in San Francisco in 1951, Fouts was a 3rd-round pick out of Oregon in 1973, backing up an aging Johnny Unitas in his final NFL season, before eventually taking over as the trigger man for Don Coryell's revolutionary system. He retired in 1987, holding 42 team records and 8 NFL records, and was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1993, his first year of eligibility. Fouts transitioned almost immediately into broadcasting, working NFL and college football coverage for CBS and ABC, for over 3 decades, including stints alongside Al Michaels on Monday Night Football and a memorable cameo as himself in the 1998 comedy The Waterboy. CBS opted not to renew his contract in 2020 at age 69, though Fouts said at the time he still wanted to continue working and enjoyed the game as much as ever. He is alive today, in his mid-70s, living in Sisters, Oregon, remaining one of the most respected voices to have called the sport he once redefined as a player. Fouts authored some of the most explosive statistical seasons any quarterback had ever produced under center. Dan Fouts simply kept working the booth for 3 decades after his playing days ended, one of the rare men from this entire offense whose story never needed a crisis to stay interesting. 6 is the head coach whose revolutionary passing offense reshaped the entire sport, and who died without ever receiving the one honor nearly every player he coached eventually got to hold. Don Coryell became the first coach in history to win over 100 games at both the college and professional levels, leading the St. Louis Cardinals and then the San Diego Chargers to an offensive system so influential that Air Coryell entered the sport's permanent vocabulary. Born in Seattle, Washington in 1924, Coryell enlisted in the Army as a paratrooper during World War II before building a college coaching career at Whittier and San Diego State, where he succeeded future Hall of Fame coach George Allen. His Chargers led the NFL in passing for 6 consecutive seasons, and by his own players' account, his system permanently changed how offensive football was designed at every level of the sport. Despite that influence, Coryell was passed over by Hall of Fame voters repeatedly throughout his life, a snub that became increasingly uncomfortable as player after player he had coached, including Dan Fouts, Kellen Winslow, and Fred Dean, were inducted into Canton without him. Don Coryell died on July 1, 2010, at age 85, having been a finalist for the Hall of Fame mere months earlier, and passed over yet again. At his memorial service, an emotional John Madden told the gathered crowd of Hall of Famers, "I'm sitting down there in front, and next to me is Joe Gibbs, and next to him is Dan Fouts, and the 3 of us are in the Hall of Fame because of Don Coryell. There's something missing." Coryell was finally inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2023, 13 years after his death. Coryell built the offensive blueprint that reshaped how the entire NFL still throws the football today. Don Coryell spent 13 years in the ground before football's own institution finally admitted what every player he ever coached had been saying about him since the day he died. They rest now in a Los Angeles home where a heart gave out on a man who spent his second act trying to save kids from his own worst mistake, and in an intensive care unit where a virus took a Hall of Famer only weeks after his final public appearance. 2 are still alive today. 1 still answering to a nickname San Diego fans have called him for 50 years, and 1 still calling football games in his mid-70s, decades removed from a playing career that never once needed a redemption arc. Don Coryell spent 13 years in the ground waiting for an honor that arrived far too late to matter to him personally. Air Coryell changed the way an entire sport moves the football, and more than 4 decades later, the men who ran it are still, one story at a time, illustrating exactly what building something revolutionary actually costs the people who build it.